Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, June 12th. You are listening to the Mo News Podcast. I am Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts. We read all of the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. So as you could tell, it is just me today, as it will be for the next few days while Moshe is away in Japan. I am back from a very quick vacation and will be holding things down here on the podcast. I have a couple of guests lined up as well. And if we thought things would be quiet while Moshe was away, so far, no such luck. So let's get to some of the headlines here. More anti-ICE protests flare up in cities across the country as a curfew remains in Los Angeles, the latest on the ground. Meanwhile, overseas, a major development as the United States is evacuating personnel from the Middle East. What's behind it? To the economy, President Trump says China and the United States have reached a trade deal, what we know about it. And remember how the stock market plunged in the days after President Trump rolled out his Liberation Day tariffs? Well, it turns out lawmakers were doing a lot of stock trading during that time period. As the U.S. gets ready for what's predicted to be a rough hurricane season, President Trump getting ready to do away with FEMA, the federal agency that responds to disasters and emergencies, what he wants to replace it. Musical legend Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys died at the age of 82, a look back at his life and legacy, the new fruits and vegetables on the so-called Dirty Dozen list, and what's on the Clean 15, and where in the country we'll find the best tippers. And of course, we will end with On This Day in History. Okay, let's start with the protests against the Trump administration's immigration raids, which have now spread from Los Angeles to other cities in the United States like New York, Chicago, Austin, and Washington, D.C. Protesters have gathered in city centers and near federal buildings across the country, all to show their opposition to immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE. Here is what one protest sounded like in New York City. ICE out of New York! ICE out of New York! While many of the demonstrations have remained peaceful, some have involved confrontations with law enforcement. Texas Governor Greg Abbott announced the deployment of the Texas National Guard across the state to ensure peace and order. In a statement, his office warned individuals who were involved in violence or property damage that they will face legal consequences. Meanwhile, the Trump administration says that it's going to be proceeding with its raids and deportation efforts despite the ongoing protests. Now back to ground zero for the protests, Los Angeles. Mayor Karen Bass said that an overnight curfew for downtown neighborhoods will remain in effect indefinitely. She said officials would consider lifting the curfew if there are fewer arrests overnight. On Wednesday, LA District Attorney Nathan Hochman said that he wants to send a clear message to anyone looking to cause trouble as protesters continue to gather in downtown Los Angeles. He said people are encouraged to engage in peaceful demonstrations, but the moment that they engage in illegal acts, they are no longer legitimate First Amendment protesters. In his words, they are criminals, and his office will enforce the law to the fullest extent. Take a listen to some of his Wednesday press conference.
There's a tremendous amount of video out there through social media and otherwise. We will know who you are, who engaged in this conduct. We will track you down. We will arrest you, we will prosecute you, and we will punish you.
Hochman says in one case, suspects allegedly shot fireworks at police officers. Two other defendants are accused of driving their motorcycles into a line of officers. LA County Sheriff Robert Luna saying his agency is looking into whether there is a conspiracy or organization behind some of the crimes committed during the recent immigration protests. But Hochman and the LA sheriff say that the idea that Los Angeles is unsafe is simply not true. They say the area where there is a curfew is about 1 square mile. The city is roughly 500 square miles. Meanwhile, dozens of mayors from across the LA region teamed up on Wednesday to demand that the Trump administration stop those immigration raids that they say have spread fear across their cities. They also continue to criticize the deployment of Marines and National Guard troops to LA. They say that only escalates the climate of fear in the region. The Trump administration said Wednesday that the troops are not carrying out law enforcement actions, but instead are protecting federal personnel and property. A reminder, President Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth authorized the deployment of about 700 Marines and more than 2,000 National Guard troops to LA. Usually, a state's governor will ask the federal government to deploy the National Guard. In this case, though, California Governor Gavin Newsom, he does not want them there. He wants the order rescinded. He calls it uncalled for and unwarranted, and has actually taken legal action against the Trump administration. The Trump administration responding to California's lawsuit, which is challenging the deployment of troops, calling the state's case meritless and urging the courts not to step in. In testimony Wednesday on Capitol Hill, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth defended the deployment of the National Guard troops and the Marines to LA amid the ongoing protests over the immigration raids. Here's some back and forth between Hegseth and Senator Jack Reed, who is a Democrat from Rhode Island. Reed thinks the deployment is illegal. Again, take a listen to a bit of this exchange, which begins with Hegseth.
And the mission in Los Angeles, as you know well, sir, is not about lethality. It's about maintaining law and order on behalf of law enforcement agents who deserve to do their job without being attacked by mobs of people. And so we're very proud that the National Guard and the Marines are on the streets defending the ICE agents, and they will continue to do that.
Law and order is a civil function under the Constitution of the United States. Civil enforcement, law enforcement authorities, not the U.S. military.
And at that same hearing, Senator Tammy Baldwin, who is a Democrat from Wisconsin, asked Hegseth what constitutional authority the administration is using to deploy active duty Marines to the protest. Hegseth said that the president has constitutional authority, but that he didn't know the specific provision. But let's take a look at the big picture here. On the campaign trail, Trump promised mass deportations. We know border crossings plummeted in the first few months of his second term, but deportations remain steady, in part because fewer people were crossing the border. Well, now the administration is taking a more aggressive posture. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, who is the architect of many of Trump's immigration policies, he has set a goal of 3,000 deportations per day. That's about 5 times the average of 660 arrests per day during Trump's first 100 days in office. With the ramped-up deportations, there are growing fears amongst the estimated 14 million unauthorized immigrants living in the United States. Workers across key sectors like agriculture, construction, childcare, and food service not showing up to work, citing fears of detention and deportation. So what does the public think of all this? Well, a CBS News YouGov poll conducted June 4th to June 6th found that about 54% of Americans approve of Trump's deportation policy. That poll completed just days before the president deployed troops to Los Angeles. Trump's strongest support on immigration comes from within his party, with 93% of Republicans backing his deportation policy. That compares to only about 18% of Democrats. But there are some Republicans expressing frustration with the crackdowns, which have arrested both criminals and undocumented immigrants who have been in the U.S. for decades. And one of those Republicans, Latinas for Trump co-founder Ileana Garcia, who is a Florida state senator, she criticized the administration's deportation efforts as, quote, unacceptable and inhumane. But again, President Trump says they will continue. Okay, now to the Middle East. With heightened tensions in the region and growing concern about the security situation, the U.S. is evacuating non-essential staff from the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and family members of military personnel from several bases in the Gulf. Additionally, General Michael Kurilla, who leads U.S. Central Command, he was scheduled to testify before Congress today, but has since canceled his appearance because of rising tension in the Middle East. It comes as President Trump's hopes have dimmed for a deal with Iran to restrict its nuclear program. He recently told the New York Post, quote, I am less confident now than I would have been a couple of months ago. Something happened to them, but I am much less confident of a deal being made. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the Foreign Minister of Iran are scheduled to meet on Sunday in Oman for their 6th round of nuclear talks. Some U.S. officials say that those talks are increasingly unlikely. Trump had set a 2-month deadline for a deal with Iran. Well, that 2-month deadline is quickly approaching. It actually expires this week. Now, the president continues to say that he wants a deal. He wants a diplomatic solution as opposed to a military conflict. But here's how the president answered a question Wednesday night about why the U.S. troops were being moved out of the region.
We're hearing reports that U.S. personnel are being moved out of the region within striking distance. Well, they are being moved out because it could be a dangerous place, and we'll see what happens. But we've given notice to move out, and we'll see what happens.
Is there anything that can be done to dial the temperature down in the region?
They can't have a nuclear weapon, very simply. They can't have a nuclear weapon. We're not going to allow that.
So Israel has reportedly been preparing to strike Iran's nuclear facilities in the event that talks fail. A couple of weeks ago, as Moshe and I discussed here on the podcast, President Trump told reporters that he had warned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to take any military action that would disrupt the nuclear talks. So the question being, what would happen if these nuclear talks break down? For its part, Tehran has recently threatened to launch missiles against U.S. military bases in the region in retaliation for any attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. So again, what does this all mean? It is really too soon to tell. Those talks between the U.S. and Iran are still scheduled for the weekend, so this could all just be precautionary, but it is definitely something to watch. Time for the speed read, starting with the economy and a potential trade deal between China and the United States. This from CNBC. President Trump says a trade deal between the world's two largest economies is, quote, done. He wrote on Truth Social, we are getting a total of 55% tariffs. China is getting 10%. He says China will supply rare earth magnets up front to the United States as part of a trade agreement, and that the U.S. in turn will make certain concessions, like allowing Chinese students to attend U.S. colleges and universities. The agreement is subject to final approval from both Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Trump says he intends to work closely with Xi to open up China to American trade. He describes that prospect as, quote, a great win for both countries. Now, if you're wondering, what are rare earth elements and magnets that we keep hearing about, and why are they so important? Well, they are widely used by the automotive and defense sectors, and China is by far the leader of the critical minerals supply chain. They produce roughly 60% of the world's supply of rare earths and process almost 90%. So that means China imports these materials from other countries and processes them. In April, China imposed export restrictions on the rare earth elements, a response to Trump's tariff increase on China. Well, here is Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick talking to CNBC on Wednesday, describing the tit-for-tat between the U.S. and China.
But the Chinese had these rare earth magnets, and they were slow rolling it. And so we started putting on, the United States, when they weren't delivering the rare earth magnets, we started putting on our countermeasures, right? We cut planes, ethanol. Marco Rubio put out that students may not be able to come to America. Scott Bessent put out, look, we're going to go send subpoenas to all the banks. And we were at mutual assured annoyance, if you will.
But Lutnick said President Trump got on the phone with President Xi, which he says changed everything. So according to the Trump administration, this deal is almost as good as done. Under the deal, U.S. tariffs on most Chinese goods will remain at 55%. Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods will hold at 10%, which marks a 115% cut from previous levels for both countries. But by the way, that 55% still a lot higher than it was just a few months ago. Sticking with the trade war from the Wall Street Journal, as markets tanked in the wake of President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs in early April, members of Congress and their families made hundreds of stock trades, shining a spotlight on a controversial practice that some lawmakers have pushed to ban. So from April 2nd, when Trump launched these sweeping tariffs, to April 8th, the day before he paused many of them, more than a dozen House lawmakers and their family members made more than 700 stock trades. That's according to a Wall Street Journal analysis of disclosure filings. And ironically, two lawmakers who have called for stock trading bans in the past, Representatives Ro Khanna, a Democrat from California, and Rob Bresnahan, a Republican from Pennsylvania, they reported the most transactions by themselves or family members. And you can also add to the list Representatives Jefferson Shreve of Indiana, a Republican, Julie Johnson, a Democrat from Texas, Michael McCaul, a Republican from Texas. So I'm just listing some of their names and parties to show that this is happening on both sides of the aisle. By the way, lawmakers are required to make filings that show the trading done by themselves as well as their close family members. And all of this happened during one of the wildest stretches for the global financial markets in the past decade. So the S&P 500, the Dow, the Nasdaq all tanked, the biggest fall since the March 2020 market crash. And then there was a huge upswing when the president announced there was going to be a 90-day pause on the tariffs. The Wall Street Journal found that House lawmakers and their families logged more trades in April than any other month in the past year. Now, to be clear, none of this is currently against the law. Some of the Congress members say the trades were made by outside financial advisors, done without their knowledge. But regardless, for years, Congress has considered various proposals that would ban lawmakers and their families from trading individual stocks. But as Moshe and I have talked about before, so far nothing really substantive has passed. And that's in part because you need Congress to pass it. So they may not necessarily be looking to put the brakes on something that is making them money. Lawmakers in 2012 did pass a law that prohibits trading on insider information and also mandating disclosure. But now Representative Seth Magaziner, a Democrat from Rhode Island, says this whole episode is a reminder that the opportunity for insider trading by members of Congress is very real, very toxic, and needs to be eliminated. And he is currently leading negotiations on a bipartisan bill that would further restrict trading. From the Associated Press, President Trump said he plans to phase out FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, after this year's hurricane season. It is the clearest timeline yet for his administration's long-term plans to dismantle the disaster relief agency. Instead, he is going to shift responsibility for response and recovery onto the states. Here's the president on Wednesday.
We want to wean off of FEMA, and we want to bring it down to the state level. A little bit like education, we're moving it back to the states so the governors can handle it. That's why they're governors now. If they can't handle it, they shouldn't be governor.
Trump added that the federal government will start distributing less federal aid for disaster recovery and that the funding will come directly from the president's office. And it all comes as NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, projects that this year's hurricane season, which officially ends on November 30th, will be particularly intense and potentially deadly. For months, Trump and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, whose department oversees FEMA, have vowed to eliminate the agency. They repeatedly have said it is ineffective and unnecessary. On the other hand, plans to eliminate FEMA have baffled federal and state emergency managers who doubt that local efforts can replace the agency's robust infrastructure for disaster response. They say most states simply do not have the budget or personnel to handle catastrophic disasters on their own. From the LA Times, Beach Boys visionary Brian Wilson has died at the age of 82. Wilson's genius for melody, arrangements, and wide-eyed self-expression inspired songs like Good Vibrations, California Girls, and other summertime anthems. So Wilson, one of the world's most influential recording artists, his family posted the news of his death to his website and social media accounts on Wednesday. Further details or a cause of death not immediately available. Since May of 2024, Wilson had been under a court conservatorship to oversee his personal and medical affairs. He had been battling mental health issues and drug addiction for decades. Brian Wilson was the eldest and last surviving of three musical brothers. Brian played bass, Carl lead guitar, and Dennis drums. The Beach Boys rose in the 1960s from a local California band to national hitmakers, to international ambassadors of surf and sun. The Beach Boys rank among the most popular groups of the rock era, with more than 30 singles in the top 40 and worldwide sales of more than 100 million. The 1966 album Pet Sounds was voted number 2 in a 2003 Rolling Stone list of best 500 albums, losing out, as Wilson had done before, to the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. All right, now to some health news. I guess we could call it health news, or maybe food news from CNN. More than 90% of samples of a dozen fruits and vegetables tested positive for potentially harmful pesticide residues. That is according to the 2025 Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce. Dubbed the Dirty Dozen, the list is compiled from the latest government testing data on non-organic produce by the Environmental Working Group, or EWG. It is a health advocacy organization that has produced this annual report since 2004. Now to the results. Spinach topped the list with more pesticide residue by weight than any other produce tested, followed by strawberries, kale, grapes, peaches, cherries, nectarines, pears, apples, blackberries, blueberries, and potatoes. Blackberries and potatoes were new to the list this year. Blackberries have never been tested before by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, while potatoes joined the rankings after being absent in recent years, mainly because of the use of a plant growth regulator called chlorprofam. According to the report, that chemical is banned in the EU. So the group says this report is not meant to discourage consumers from eating fruits and vegetables, but instead to provide tools for decisions on whether to buy organic for the fruits or vegetables that their families consume the most. On the other hand, you've got the Alliance for Food and Farming, which represents both organic and conventional produce farmers. They are a long-standing critic of this annual report, saying that, quote, consumers should be reassured by decades of toxicology studies, government data, and nutrition research, which underscores the importance of a diet rich in fruits and vegetables on health and the safety of both organic and conventionally grown produce. By the way, not all bad news. As part of the report, EWG also creates the annual Clean 15, which is a list of conventional produce with the least amount of pesticide residue. Many of these fruits and veggies are protected by skins that you peel before eating, but not all. So pineapple, the least contaminated produce tested, followed by sweet corn, avocados, papaya, onions, frozen sweet peas, asparagus, cabbage, watermelon, cauliflower, bananas, mangoes, carrots, mushrooms, and kiwi. And finally, from Axios, Delaware, West Virginia, and New Hampshire are home to America's best tippers. This is according to some new data from Toast. So diners leave nearly 21% for tips or more on average. On the other end, you've got California and Washington State, where the average tips run under 18%. Something to watch for here. No tax on tips proposals have been working their way through Congress. They could wind up on the president's desk as part of this major spending package. So nationwide, the average tip at a full-service restaurant rose from 19.3% at the end of 2024 to 19.4% in early 2025, so slightly up. According to the report, we're down a bit from a high that we saw in the pandemic, which was about 19.9%, and similar to the levels that we saw in 2018 and 2019. All right, time for On This Day in History. On June 12th, 1931, Al Capone was indicted on 5,000 counts of prohibition and perjury. On June 12th, 1942, Anne Frank, a young Jewish girl living in Amsterdam, got a diary for her 13th birthday. A month later, she and her family went into hiding from the Nazis. The families were eventually discovered by the Gestapo, which had been tipped off in 1944. The Franks were sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp. That's where Anne's mother was killed. Anne and her sister were transferred to another camp, Bergen-Belsen, where Anne died a month before the war ended. Anne's father survived Auschwitz and published her diary in 1947 as The Diary of a Young Girl. It has since been translated into more than 60 languages. On this day in 1967, the United States Supreme Court, in a landmark case of Loving v. Virginia, ruled that all state laws which banned interracial marriage were unconstitutional. On this day in 1972, the first Popeyes, originally named Chicken on the Run, opened in New Orleans. On this day in 1987, in one of his most famous Cold War speeches, President Ronald Reagan challenges Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall, referring to the Berlin Wall. On this day in 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were murdered outside of her Los Angeles, California home. And ending with a little pop culture, on this day in 1981, the action-adventure film Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Harrison Ford, was released in theaters. It was a huge success and spawned numerous sequels. All right, everyone, that is a wrap. Thank you for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. Those reviews really do matter. And stick with me this week while Moshe's out. I will have all of the news. It'll be short and sweet. Have a wonderful Friday Eve. I will see you guys back here on Friday.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.